Ethan Miller hunched over a scratched wooden table in the biology lab at Lincoln High School, his pencil sketching cell diagrams on a worn legal pad. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow over rows of microscopes and glass beakers. His dark, wild hair fell into his eyes, and his glasses had slipped down his nose for the third time in 10 minutes. He adjusted them with a quick, nervous flick of his finger, a habit he had picked up in Oregon. Outside, the Ohio sun beat down on the brick walls of the school, but Ethan barely noticed. He was too focused, trying to blend into the background of his new life. It was his second week at Lincoln High, and Ethan still felt like a ghost. In Portland, he'd had friends, a routine, a place where he belonged. Here, in this small suburban town, he was just a new kid with the wrong sneakers and a backpack that screamed, outsider. At 17, he was normal in every way. Average height, skinny, with eyes that darted away when someone stared too long. But there was something else about Ethan. Something he kept secret. Something his grandmother, Alice, had taught him to keep as a secret. "Ethan, are you okay?" Ms. Harper, the biology teacher, called from the front of the lab, her voice kind but distracted as she sorted through the lab reports. "Yeah, great," Ethan muttered without looking up, his voice barely above the hum of the air conditioner. Ms. Harper nodded, already turning to another student. Ethan returned to his diagram, tracing the lines of the mitochondria with precision. He liked the lab. It was quiet, orderly, a place where he could lose himself in his work. But the quiet at Lincoln High didn't last long. The lab door swung open and noise came from the hallway, laughter, the squeak of sneakers, the thud of a backpack against a locker. Ethan didn't look up. He didn't need to. He had learned to recognize the sounds of trouble. "Yo, new guy!" The voice cut through the lab like a blade. Ethan's pencil froze. He looked up to see Brandon Clark leaning against the doorframe, his basketball jersey clinging to his broad shoulders. Brandon was everything Ethan wasn't. Tall, athletic, with blonde hair styled to perfection and a smile that screamed confidence. His blue eyes fixed on Ethan, sharp and mocking. Jake Reed and Tyler Brown lingered behind him, grinning like they'd just heard the best joke of the day. Ethan's stomach twisted, but he kept his face impassive. "What?" he asked, lowering his voice. Brandon sauntered over, his sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. "Are you lost, or just lonely?" No one sits in the lab during lunch unless they're hiding. Jake, wiry and quick with a laugh, chimed in. "Yeah, man, what's with the nerdy vibes? You trying to get in the teacher's good graces yet?" Tyler, the larger, quieter one, crossed his arms and leaned against the lab table, blocking Ethan's path to the door. The air felt heavier, as if the room were shrinking. "I'm just working," Ethan said, his gaze flicking back to his notebook. He tightened his grip on his pencil, hoping they would get bored and leave. Brandon leaned closer, his shadow falling across Ethan's work. "Working? Man, you're in Ohio now. No one cares about your little drawings." He reached out and flicked Ethan's notebook, sending it sliding across the table. Ethan lunged to grab it, his glasses slipping off again. He caught the pad before it hit the floor, but his cheeks were burning. A few other students in the lab glanced, but quickly looked away. No one wanted to cross Brandon Clark, the star basketball player and son of the city's biggest car dealer. He ruled Lincoln High like it was his own kingdom. "Calm down, man, it's just a joke," Brandon said, his smile widening. "You're so serious, relax." Jake chuckled. "Yeah, relax, Oregon. You look like you're about to cry." Ethan adjusted his glasses and stared at his notebook, willing his heart to stop pounding. "I'm fine," he said, barely above a whisper. "Great," Brandon mocked, mimicking Ethan's soft tone. "It's like you're invisible, dude. No one even knows your name." "Ethan," he said, louder than he intended. The word hung in the air, and for a moment the lab was silent. Even Miss Harper glanced up, but she was too far away to hear the tension. Brandon raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Ethan, huh? Cool. Good to hear." He turned to Jake and Tyler. "Let's jump. This guy's too boring to mess with." As they strutted out, Jake called over his shoulder. "See you later, Invisible Ethan." Tyler chuckled and the door slammed behind them. Ethan took a shaky breath. His fingers shook as he opened his notebook again, but the lines of his diagram were blurry. He wasn't invisible. He was just trying to survive. In Oregon, his grandmother had warned him not to stand out. "You have a gift, Ethan," she said, her voice low and serious. "But it's not for showing off. It's for protection, for healing. Use it wrong, and you lose yourself." He had felt the gift once or twice. Little things like the way glass shook when he was angry, or the way a door creaked open without him touching it. He had promised Alice he would keep it a secret, but here at this new school it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain control. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Ethan gathered his things and headed to the cafeteria to grab what was left of the food line. The room was a chaos of voices, rattling trays, and the smell of overcooked pizza. Students crowded around the tables, laughing and shouting. Ethan kept his head down, grabbing a turkey sandwich and an apple before looking for a place to sit. He spotted an empty table by the window and headed straight for it, but Brandon's voice stopped him. "Yo, Ethan!" "Over here." Brandon was sitting at the center table, surrounded by his usual crew of cheerleaders, jocks, and hangers-on. He waved mockingly, holding a carton of milk. "There's room for you, invisible man." Jake laughed, slapping the table. "Yeah, join the cool kids." Ethan gripped the tray tighter. It seemed like every eye in the cafe was on him, waiting for him to do something. He forced his voice to remain level. "I'm fine," he said, turning to the empty table. But Brandon wasn't done. He stood up, walking around with that same cocky grin. "Come on, don't be like that. You're new. We're just being friendly." He reached out and knocked an apple off Ethan's tray. It hit the floor with a thud, rolling under the table. Ethan froze. His pulse pounded in his ears, and for a split second he felt it. A tingling warmth in his chest. The same feeling he'd gotten in Oregon when he was angry. The milk carton on his tray swayed slightly as if caught in a breeze no one else could feel. Ethan clenched his jaw and forced the feeling away. Not here. Not now. "Oops," Brandon said, shrugging. "My fault. You should watch your stuff, Ethan." He turned back to his desk, high-fiving Jake as the cafe erupted in laughter. Ethan knelt down to pick up the apple, his face burning. He sat at the empty table, staring at his sandwich, the noise of the room pressing in on him. He wasn't invisible. He was a target. And deep down, he knew Brandon wouldn't stop. Not until something, or someone, made him. As he took a bite of his sandwich, Ethan's phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from his grandmother. "Stay strong, Ethan. You're more than they see." He stared at the words, the tingling in his chest fading but not going away. He didn't want to use his gift. But if Brandon kept pushing, he might not have a choice. Ethan Miller made his way through the crowded hallway of Lincoln High School, clutching his books to his chest. His backpack slung over one shoulder and his glasses had slipped back down to the tip of his nose. The noise around him, lockers slamming, laughter, snatches of conversation, was like the heavy air before a storm. Ethan tried not to look around, but the stares of his classmates burned his back. He was new, an outsider, and the feeling clung to him like the smell of damp in an old house. The hallway was buzzing like a beehive. Girls in cheerleader shirts giggled at their lockers, boys in basketball shoes joked around. Ethan turned toward his locker, hoping to slip by unnoticed. But luck was not on his side today. "Hey, Oregon!" Brandon Clark's voice cut through the noise like a siren. Ethan tensed but didn't turn around. He opened his locker, focusing on his books, as if that would save him. Brandon appeared next to him, his shadow falling over Ethan. Behind him, as always, were Jake Reed, with his perpetually mocking grin, and Tyler Brown, silent but imposing as a wall. "What? Are you being a nerd again?" Brandon crossed his arms, his basketball jersey highlighting his muscular shoulders. "Don't you have anything better to do?" "Just going to class," Ethan said quietly, not looking up. He shoved his biology textbook into his backpack, trying not to show his pounding heart. Jake chuckled, leaning against a nearby locker. "Nice move, dude. Hiding behind books? Is that how everyone is in Oregon?" Tyler stepped closer, blocking the way. His eyes were empty, but his presence was oppressive. Ethan felt heat rise to his cheeks. "Let me in," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Brandon leaned down, his face inches from Ethan's. "Relax, new kid. We're just getting acquainted." He reached out and casually pushed Ethan's textbook. It slipped from his hands and fell to the floor, pages crumpled. Ethan crouched to pick up the book, feeling the other students' eyes on him. Some giggled, some looked away. He picked up the book, but Brandon didn't let up. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said, feigning sympathy. "I didn't mean to." "You weren't offended, were you?" "No," Ethan muttered, standing up, his fingers gripping his textbook so tightly his knuckles were white. "That's good." Brandon clapped him on the shoulder, harder than necessary. "Don't be such a bore, Oregon." He turned to his buddies. "Come on, it's boring out here." Jake grinned. Bye, nerd. They left, their laughter echoing down the hall. Ethan leaned against his locker, exhaling. His fingers brushed the metal door, and for a second it felt like it gave under his palm, like soft putty. He jerked his hand away, his heart pounding. Easy, he told himself. It wasn't the first time. Strange moments like this happened when he was angry. But here, among strangers, he couldn't let himself lose control. Things got worse in gym class. The Lincoln High gym smelled of rubber and sweat, basketballs pinged across the floor, and Coach King's whistle cut through the air. Ethan stood off to the side in his baggy gym clothes, feeling even more out of place. His skinny legs stuck out of his shorts like sticks, and he tried not to look at the other boys throwing the ball around as if they'd been born with it. "Miller, don't sleep," barked Coach King, a bald man with a red face. "Get in line, we're picking teams." Ethan took the place at the back, knowing he would be last. And so it was. Brandon, the captain of one of the teams, looked at him and grinned. "Okay, take him," he told the other team, as if Ethan were extra baggage. But in the end, the coach assigned Ethan to Brandon's team. "Come on, Clark. Make a player out of him," King muttered, walking to the bench. The game started, and Ethan knew right away that this wasn't about basketball. Brandon threw the ball so hard that it hit Ethan in the chest, knocking the wind out of him. "Better catch it, Oregon," Brandon yelled, and Jake burst out laughing. "This isn't biology class." Ethan picked up the ball, but was immediately surrounded. Tyler shoved him with his shoulder, and Ethan barely stayed on his feet. The ball was snatched away, and Brandon shouted, "Run faster, dude! Or are you just fast at your desks?" Coach King stared at his phone, oblivious to Brandon and his friends turning the game into a travesty. Ethan tried to participate, but every pass Brandon made was either too strong or too wide. By the end of the lesson, Ethan was drenched in sweat and his team had lost by a landslide. "Tough, huh?" Brandon winked as he walked off the court. "Get used to it, new kid." Ethan trudged silently toward the locker room, anger boiling inside him. He wanted to respond, to fight back, but his grandmother's words echoed in his head. "Your gift is for protection, not revenge, Ethan." He clenched his fists, and the locker next to him shook slightly as if the metal was responding to his emotions. Ethan quickly stepped away, checking to see if anyone had noticed. No one had. Yet. At home, in his small room with boxes still unpacked from the move, Ethan collapsed on his bed. He pulled out his phone and dialed his grandmother. Alice Miller answered on the second ring, her voice warm but stern. "Ethan, how are you?" she asked. "Not really," he admitted, looking up at the ceiling. "It's complicated. The guys at school are bothering me, one in particular. Brandon, it's like he wants me to break. And you want to teach him a lesson?" Grandma's voice was calm, but there was steel in it. Ethan hesitated. "Sometimes. But I know I shouldn't. You always said that a gift comes with a responsibility." "That's right," Alice said. "You're stronger than they think, Ethan. But strength doesn't come from destroying them. It comes from being yourself, even when you're pushed over the edge. Endure, but don't break. Your moment will come." Ethan nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I'm trying, Grandma, I really am." "I know," she replied, "and I believe in you." He hung up, but Alice's words did nothing to calm the storm inside. Ethan stood up and walked to the mirror. His reflection looked tired, but there was a sparkle in his eyes, something he didn't quite understand. He remembered the way the locker had buckled under his fingers, the way the ball at the gym almost flew when he got angry. The gift was there, inside, and it was becoming harder and harder to contain. Ethan walked back to the table where his backpack lay. He pulled out his biology textbook, but his mind was not on cells and mitochondria. Brandon and his friends would not stop, and Ethan knew it. He could be patient like his grandmother had taught him, but patience had its limits, and he felt like those limits were approaching. The Lincoln High School cafeteria was a hive of activity. Hundreds of voices mingled in a single hum. Trays banged. The smell of French fries and pizza permeated the air. Ethan Miller squeezed into line, clutching a plastic tray. His dark hair fell into his eyes, his glasses slipped down his nose, and he pushed them up with a practiced motion. Third week at a new school, and he still felt like an outsider. He picked out a turkey sandwich and an apple, trying not to look around. The cafeteria was a minefield. Too many eyes, too many chances to be targeted. Ethan made his way to a table at the back, by the window, away from the center where Brandon Clark and company occupied the top table like kings on a throne. Brandon, in his basketball jersey, was laughing at something Jake Reed was showing on his phone. Tyler Brown, as always, was silently munching on a burger, but his eyes were scanning the room for entertainment. Ethan sank into a chair, hoping to go unnoticed. But luck, as usual, passed him by. His phone vibrated. Ethan glanced at the screen. A notification from a school social media chat. Someone had posted a photo of himself hunched over a tray in the cafeteria with the caption, "New kids' lunch, loser sandwich." The post already had a dozen likes and laughing emojis. Ethan pressed his lips together, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks. He knew who was doing this. "Hey, Oregon!" Brandon's voice carried over the noise of the cafeteria. Ethan looked up. Brandon was standing at his desk, holding his phone. "Did you see my post? You're a celebrity now." Jake laughed, pointing at the screen. "Dude, you're a TikTok star? We need to make another video." Tyler chuckled, putting down his burger. "Yeah, let's record him chewing. It'll be a hit." Ethan stared at his sandwich, trying to ignore the giggles around him. A few students turned to look, some whispering, some openly giggling. He felt the familiar tingle in his chest, the same one he got when his anger got the better of him. He clenched his fists under the table, forcing his breathing to even out. "Not here," he repeated his grandmother's words in his mind. "Don't lose control." But Brandon didn't let up. He came closer, his sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. "What, Oregon, are you speechless?" He leaned over Ethan's desk, his shadow falling over the tray. "Or are you too busy to chat with us?" "I'm just eating," Ethan said quietly, not looking up. His voice was shaking, but he was trying to keep his composure. "Just eating?" Brandon mimicked, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "Did you hear that, guys? He's just eating. What a boring dude." Laughter rippled through the dining room. Ethan saw a girl named Mia sitting at the next table, glance at him. Her dark eyes met his, and for a second it looked like she was about to say something. But Brandon glanced at her, and Mia quickly looked away, staring at her phone. Ethan felt a pang of disappointment. Even those who weren't bullying were afraid to mess with Brandon. "Don't be such a bore," Brandon continued, leaning his hands on the table. "Maybe you should smile? Or is that not how you do things in Oregon?" "Leave me alone," Ethan said, a little louder. His fingers tightened around the edge of the tray, and he felt the plastic give slightly, like pliable clay. He released his grip immediately, hoping no one had noticed. Brandon grinned. "Wow, he talked! Look, he has a voice." He turned to Jake. "Write that down, man. This is historic." Jake pulled out his phone, aiming the camera at Ethan. "Smile, Oregon. You want to go viral, right?" Ethan stood up, scooping up the tray. "I'm leaving," he said, trying to keep his voice even. He started toward the exit, but Tyler stepped forward, blocking his way. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" Tyler asked, crossing his arms. His voice was low, menacing. "We're not done yet." Ethan paused, feeling the tingling in his chest grow stronger. He looked at Tyler, then at Brandon, who was still grinning. The cafeteria was silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Ethan took a deep breath. "Let me through," he said, and there was a firmness in his voice that he hadn't expected. Brandon laughed, but it sounded forced. Okay, go," he said, waving his hand. "But don't think this is the end, Oregon." Ethan pushed past Tyler, eyes on his back. He threw his half-eaten sandwich into the trash and slipped out of the cafeteria, his heart pounding. The hallway was empty, his footsteps echoing off the lockers. He turned toward the library, to a quiet corner behind the stacks where no one could find him. Ethan sat down on the floor and leaned against the wall, trying to calm himself. He pulled out his biology book, but he couldn't concentrate. The anger was still bubbling inside him, and with it, that tingling feeling. He looked down at the book in his hands, and suddenly it shook as if someone was tugging at it. Ethan gasped, dropping the book. It hung in the air for a split second before it hit the floor. He looked around, making sure no one had seen it. His heart was pounding. "Shit," he whispered, picking up the book. His gift, as his grandmother had called it, was real, but it scared him. He didn't want to be a freak, didn't want to stand out. He just wanted to be left alone. Ethan heard footsteps and looked up. Mr. Daniels, an elderly janitor with kind eyes, approached him. He stopped when he saw Ethan. "Everything okay, son?" he asked, wiping his hands on his apron. Ethan nodded, even though it wasn't true. "Yeah, fine." Mr. Daniels looked at him carefully. You know, children can be cruel sometimes. But hang in there. You'll find your place. I'm trying, Ethan said quietly, looking at the floor. I believe you, the janitor replied, patting him on the shoulder. If anything happens, I'm here. He walked away, leaving Ethan alone. Ethan opened the book, but his mind was elsewhere. Brandon wouldn't stop, that much was clear. The social media post, the taunts, the looks, it was all just the beginning. He remembered his grandmother's words. Your gift is a gift, but also a responsibility. Use it to protect, not to destroy. But how can you protect yourself when the whole world seems to be against you? Ethan clutched the book, feeling the pages crumple slightly under his fingers, as if under invisible pressure. He let go, exhaling. He needed to be patient, but his patience was fading with each passing day. The Lincoln High School quad was filled with noise. Cheerleaders practicing moves on the sideline, boys throwing frisbees, and groups of girls giggling over their phones. Ethan Miller made his way through the crowd, clutching his backpack to his chest. His glasses had slipped down his nose, but he didn't bother adjusting them, too busy trying not to bump into anyone. The sun was beating down off the asphalt, and sweat was trickling down his back. Ethan was headed toward the biology lab where he hoped to escape the chaos of lunchtime. But the quad was another minefield, where Brandon Clark and his buddies could catch him at any moment. He was almost to the door of the dorm when he heard a familiar voice. Hey, Oregon, where are you going in such a hurry? Brandon was standing by the bench flanked by Jake Reed and Tyler Brown. His basketball jersey was shining in the sun and his grin promised trouble. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. He wanted to walk past, but Jake stepped forward, blocking his way. What, back to your lab? Jake asked, pointing at Ethan's backpack. Are those your secret potions? Tyler chuckled, crossing his arms. Maybe he's doing magic, he said, his low voice almost menacing. I'm just going to class, Ethan said quietly, trying not to make eye contact. He tried to get around Jake, but Jake shoved him with his shoulder, and the textbook slipped out of Ethan's hands, clattering onto the pavement. Brandon laughed, picking up the book. Oh, biology? Really? He flipped through the pages, pretending to read. Are you really into this? He threw the book back, but missed on purpose, and it landed in the dust at Ethan's feet. Several students paused, watching. Some giggled, some looked away. Ethan crouched to pick up his textbook, his cheeks burning with humiliation. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice barely audible. What are we doing? Brandon leaned closer, his eyes glittering with amusement. Just helping you fit in, Oregon. You don't want to be a loser forever, do you? Jake pulled out his phone, aiming the camera. Smile, dude. This is for our collection. He snapped the photo, and Ethan watched as the screen lit up with a new post. New kid drops his stuff. Classic. Ethan stood up, clutching his textbook. His fingers were shaking, and he felt the familiar tingle in his chest, the same one that came when anger overwhelmed him. The bench next to him suddenly creaked, as if the metal had buckled under an invisible weight. Ethan quickly looked away, hoping no one had noticed. Leave me, he said, trying to keep his voice even. Brandon smirked. Keep it? Come on, we're just kidding. He stepped closer, his sneakers squeaking on the pavement. You know what your problem is? You look like you're wearing thrift stores. Is that your style? Tyler shoved Ethan in the shoulder and he stumbled, barely keeping his balance. The laughter around him grew louder and Ethan felt the heat of anger rise in his throat. He wanted to respond, but his grandmother's words echoed in his head. Strength without compassion is cruelty. He clenched his fists and walked away, ignoring Brandon's shouts. Run, Oregon! Hide in your books. Ethan reached the building, his heart pounding. He slipped into the biology lab where the silence and the smell of chemicals were a relief. He closed the door, leaned against the wall, and exhaled. The lab was his sanctuary. Rows of test tubes, microscopes, posters of cellular structures. Here he could breathe. He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop to finish his biology project, a study of cell division. But his thoughts were jumbled. The social media post, the laughter, the looks, all of it was spinning around in his head like a broken record. He remembered the creaking of a bench in the yard, the book in the library flying for a split second. His gift, or curse, as he sometimes thought, was becoming harder to control. Ethan closed his eyes and spoke to himself quietly but out loud. I can't let them win. But I can't. He trailed off, remembering Granny Alice's words. I have to be better. Not for them. For me. He opened his laptop and tried to focus, but the anger was still smoldering inside him. Ethan knew Brandon wouldn't stop. The taunts in the cafeteria, the shoves in the hallway, now the photo. It was all getting worse. He could endure it, like his grandmother had taught him, but he was running out of patience. He looked down at his hands resting on the table. The test tube next to him shook slightly, as if it had been jolted. Ethan jerked his hands away, his heart pounding. Easy, he whispered. Easy. The lab door creaked, and Ethan jumped. Mia, the girl from the cafeteria, walked in, holding a stack of papers. Her dark hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and there was a hesitation in her eyes. Hey, she said, pausing at the door. Are you okay? Ethan looked at her in surprise. Oh, yeah, fine, he replied, adjusting his glasses. What are you doing here? Miss Harper asked me to bring the lab reports, Mia said, placing the papers on the teacher's desk. She hesitated, looking at Ethan. Listen, I saw what happened in the yard. Brandon, he's a jerk. Don't pay attention to him. Easy to say, Ethan muttered, but his voice softened. Thank you for coming. Mia nodded but didn't leave. He's so annoying, you know. You're not alone. She paused, then added, But you're holding up better than I could. Ethan smiled faintly. I'm not sure. Sometimes I wish... He stopped, afraid to say too much. Feel like fighting back? Mia raised an eyebrow. I understand. But be careful. Brandon doesn't like being crossed. I noticed, Ethan said, and they both chuckled slightly. Mia walked away, leaving him alone, but her words left a warm mark. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he wasn't completely invisible. Ethan turned back to the project, but his thoughts still swirled around Brandon. He knew the bully's next move would be worse. The photo on social media was no longer just a joke. It was public humiliation. He remembered his grandmother teaching him to breathe, to focus, to channel his energy. Your gift is tied to your emotions, she'd said. Control them, and you control the power. He closed his laptop and stood, looking at the test tubes on the shelf. One of them trembled again, and Ethan felt the tingling in his chest get stronger. He could stop this. He could make Brandon regret it. But his grandmother's words were louder. You're stronger than they think, but strength comes from being yourself. Ethan clenched his fists and walked out of the lab. He didn't know how much longer he could hold back, but he knew the point of no return was near. The biology lab at Lincoln High School was empty and quiet, lit only by the dim light of the overhead lamps. Ethan Miller sat at his desk, hunched over a project on cell division. Test tubes and microscopes were neatly lined up on a shelf, and the faint smell of disinfectant hung in the air. His glasses had slipped down his nose, but he didn't notice, his attention riveted on the laptop where he was entering the latest data. The lab was his after-school sanctuary, a place to hide from Brandon Clark and his entourage. But today, the silence felt ominous. The door creaked, and Ethan looked up with a start. Brandon, Jake Reed, and Tyler Brown stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the light from the hallway, and Brandon's smirk was ominous. Well, look who's here, he said, shoving his hands into the pockets of his basketball jersey. Our favorite nerd. Ethan's hand tightened around his pen, his heart pounding. He was alone. There were no teachers around, and the school was nearly empty. I'm finishing up, he said quietly, trying to keep his voice even. He began packing his backpack, but his movements were slow. Careful. You finishing? Brandon stepped inside, his sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. No, Oregon, you're just getting started. Jake and Tyler followed, closing the door. The click of the lock echoed in the silence. Ethan stood up, clutching his backpack to his chest. What do you want? He asked, feeling the heat of anger mingle with the chill of fear. Brandon smiled, but there was no humor in his eyes. We've been thinking, he said, coming closer. You've been at our school for a month now, and you still don't understand how things work. There is a routine, Oregon, and everyone has their place. Jake chuckled, pulling out his phone. Smile, dude. This is going to be your best moment. He turned on the camera, pointing it at Ethan. Tyler stepped toward the exit, blocking the way, his massive frame blocking the last hope of escape. Relax, he said in a low voice. This is just fun. Ethan retreated toward the table, his back against the edge. I don't want trouble, he said, but his voice was shaking. The tingling in his chest, familiar and dangerous, was growing stronger with each passing second. Brandon pulled a marker out of his pocket and waved it. "You know what's wrong with you?" he said, stepping closer. "You're too serious. You need some style." He nodded at Tyler, who grabbed Ethan's arms, pinning them to his sides. "Let go!" Ethan jerked, but Tyler was stronger, his grip like a steel vise. "What are you doing?" Brandon laughed, uncapping his marker. "Just a little makeup, Oregon. Time to make you a social media star." He stepped forward, the marker aimed at Ethan's face. Jake giggled, filming the whole thing with his phone. "Go on, Brandon. Give him a mustache." Ethan struggled, but Tyler held him tight. Anger flared, the tingling in his chest almost unbearable. He remembered his grandmother's words. Your gift is for protection, not revenge. But now he was trapped, and his patience was snapped. "That's enough," Ethan said, his voice unexpectedly firm. Brandon froze, the marker a centimeter from his face. "What?" Brandon narrowed his eyes, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Are you threatening me, loser?" "I said, enough," Ethan repeated, his eyes meeting Brandon's. The room seemed to shrink. The air grew colder. The test tubes on the shelf shook, making a soft ringing sound. Jake lowered the phone, his smile fading. "Hey, what the hell?" he said, looking at the shelf. "Are you doing this?" Tyler tightened his grip on Ethan's hands, but his gaze darted to Brandon. "Maybe that's enough, Bran," he muttered. Brandon snorted, but his hand shook. "He's just kidding." He raised the marker again. "Now we're—" "I said stop!" Ethan's voice boomed, and there was a strange, deep note in it, like an echo from another world. His eyes flared with a faint light, and the lab seemed to shake. The test tubes rattled louder. The papers on the table flew up, as if in a gust of wind. Brandon recoiled, the marker falling from his hand. "What the—" he began, but then stopped. His blonde hair suddenly moved, as if caught in an invisible wind, and began to fall. First one strand, then another, slid to the floor like autumn leaves. Brandon touched his head, his fingers grabbing a handful of hair. "No!" he screamed, his voice breaking into a squeal. Jake dropped his phone. It clattered to the floor. "Brandon, your hair." He reached for his own head and gasped as dark strands began to fall over his shoulders. "What are you doing, dude?" Tyler released Ethan and stepped back, his eyes wide. "Is that you?" he muttered, clutching at his red hair. It, too, was beginning to fall, clumping onto the floor. Ethan stood still, his breathing heavy but his voice calm. "I warned you," he said. His eyes still glowed faintly, and the air in the lab trembled with energy. "You've gone too far." Brandon fell to his knees, gathering his hair from the floor. You're a freak!" he screamed, but there was fear in his voice, not anger. "What have you done to us?" Jake was panicking, trying to catch his hair, his hands shaking. "Stop it!" he begged. "Please, man, stop it!" Tyler pressed himself against the wall, his face pale. "Are you a witch or something?" he muttered, looking at the pile of red hair at his feet. Ethan stepped toward Jake's phone, which lay on the floor. He picked it up, checked the recording, and pressed stop. "This is staying with me," he said, his voice cold but firm. "You will never touch me again. Ever. You will tell everyone this was a stupid prank of yours that went wrong. Understand?" Brandon looked at him, his eyes full of horror. He nodded, unable to speak. Jake and Tyler nodded too, their faces as white as chalk. Ethan pocketed the phone and looked at them. "If you tell anyone what happened here," he said, "it won't be the worst thing that happens to you." He turned, grabbed his backpack, and headed for the door. "Hey," Brandon croaked, still sitting on the floor. Who are you?" Ethan stopped, not turning around. "Just a guy who wanted to be left alone," he said, and walked out, leaving them in the silence of the lab, surrounded by clumps of their hair. The biology lab at Lincoln High School seemed frozen in time. Fluorescent lights flickered, casting harsh shadows across tables covered in test tubes and microscopes. Ethan Miller stood at his desk, his backpack on the floor, his heart pounding. Across from him, Brandon Clark held a marker, ready to draw on Ethan's face for another humiliating video. Jake Reed filmed everything with his phone, smirking, and Tyler Brown held Ethan's arms tightly, preventing him from escaping. The air in the room thickened, as if a thunderstorm were approaching. "Relax, Oregon," Brandon said, his voice dripping with mockery. "This is just a joke. You'll be a TikTok star?" He stepped closer, the marker aimed at Ethan's cheek. Ethan jerked, but Tyler's grip was iron. "Let me go," he said, his voice shaking with anger. The tingling in his chest that he'd been holding back for so long was building like an electric current. "Let him go?" Brandon laughed, looking at Jake. "Did you hear that? He thinks he's in charge here?" Jake giggled, adjusting the camera. "Come on, Brand, give him a mustache." Ethan gritted his teeth, his glasses sliding down his nose. He remembered Granny Alice's words. "Your gift is for protection, not revenge." But now he was trapped, surrounded by 3 bullies, and his patience was snapped. Anger was welling up in him, and the tingling was almost palpable, like heat in his veins. "That's enough," Ethan said, his voice unexpectedly firm. Brandon froze, the marker hovering in midair. "What did you just say?" Brandon narrowed his eyes, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. Ethan looked straight at him, his dark eyes flashing with a faint, unearthly light. "I said enough," he repeated, and his voice shook with a strange resonance, like an echo from the depths. The room seemed to shrink. The air grew colder. The test tubes on the shelf began to shake, making a high-pitched ringing sound, and the papers on the table rustled as if in a gust of wind. Jake lowered the phone, his grin fading. "Hey, what the hell?" he muttered, looking at the shelf. "Is this an earthquake or something?" Tyler tightened his grip on Ethan's hands, but his gaze darted to Brandon. "Bran, maybe that's enough?" he said, his voice unsure. Brandon snorted, trying to save face. "He's just being silly." He raised the marker again. "We're going to—" "Stop!" Ethan's voice boomed like thunder. The lights overhead flickered and the lab shook. The test tubes clinked louder, and one cracked, spilling liquid onto the table. Ethan's eyes burned brighter, and the air around him seemed to vibrate. Brandon stumbled back, the marker falling from his hand and rolling across the floor. "What the—" Brandon began, but his voice trailed off. His blonde hair suddenly stirred as if by an invisible wind and began to fall. First a thin strand, then another, slid to the floor like ash. He touched his head, his fingers clutching a handful of hair. "No!" he screamed, his voice breaking into a shriek. "What are you doing?" Jake dropped his phone. It hit the floor with a loud thud. "Brandon, your hair!" He reached for his head and gasped as dark strands fell over his shoulders. "Dude, it's him. He's doing something." Tyler let go of Ethan and backed up against the wall, his eyes wide. "Is that you?" he muttered, clutching at his red hair. It, too, was beginning to fall, settling in clumps on the floor like autumn leaves. Ethan stood still, his breathing heavy, but his voice calm. "I warned you," he said. His eyes still glowed, and the room shook with invisible energy. "You've gone too far." Brandon fell to his knees, gathering his hair from the floor. You're a freak," he screamed, but there was only fear in his voice. "Stop it! Now!" Jake was panicking, trying to catch his hair, his hands shaking. "Please, man, stop," he begged, his face pale. "We didn't mean to, I swear." Tyler pressed himself against the wall, his massive frame cowering. "Are you a sorcerer?" he muttered, looking down at the pile of red hair at his feet. "What kind of monster are you?" Ethan stepped toward Jake's phone, which lay on the floor. He picked it up, checked the recording, and hit stop. The screen showed their panic, their hair falling, his own eyes glowing. "I'm keeping this," he said, his voice cold but firm. "You won't touch me again, ever. You'll tell everyone this was a stupid prank of yours that went wrong. Understand?" Brandon looked up at him, his face twisted in horror. He nodded, unable to speak. Jake and Tyler nodded too, their eyes full of fear. Ethan pocketed the phone and looked at them. "If you tell anyone what happened here," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "it won't be the worst thing that happens to you." He picked up his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and headed for the door. "Hey," Brandon croaked, still sitting on the floor. "Who the hell are you?" Ethan paused in the doorway, not turning around. "Just a guy who wanted to be left alone," he said. The door slammed behind him, leaving Brandon, Jake, and Tyler in the quiet of the lab, surrounded by clumps of their hair. The hallway was empty, except for the echo of Ethan's footsteps through the lockers. He stepped out into the schoolyard, where the sun was setting, turning the sky orange. His heart was still pounding, but his anger had been replaced by a strange feeling, a mixture of relief and guilt. He had used his gift, as his grandmother had taught him, but it was more than a defense. It was a warning. Ethan pulled out his phone and looked at the video. It had captured everything. Brandon's taunts, his panic, his hair falling out. He could have destroyed them with a social media post, but that wasn't his style. He shoved the phone back in his pocket and walked home, feeling the weight of the last few weeks lift off his shoulders. But his grandmother's words echoed in his head. Strength without compassion is cruelty. He knew what he'd done, and he knew it wasn't over. It was a bright morning at Lincoln High School, sunlight streaming through the hallways and reflecting off the metal lockers. Ethan Miller walked to his first period, his backpack swinging slightly over his shoulder. His glasses were slid down his nose as usual, but he didn't bother adjusting them. Something inside him had changed after yesterday in the biology lab. He could still feel the echoes of that moment, the shaking test tubes, the falling hair of Brandon, Jake, and Tyler, their terrified faces. He'd used his gift, and the world seemed different now. The hallways hummed with the usual noises, doors slamming, laughter, snatches of conversation. But today, the looks Ethan caught were different. Some whispered, sneaking glances at him. Some looked away, as if afraid to meet his gaze. Ethan noticed a group of girls at their lockers go silent as he passed. He didn't know what had spread through the school, but rumors were already circulating. Things became clearer in the dining room at lunch. Ethan picked up a tray with a sandwich and an apple and headed to his usual spot by the window. But as soon as he sat down, he noticed Brandon, Jake, and Tyler at their center table. They looked different. Their heads were smooth as billiard balls, and they were unusually quiet. Brandon, usually loud and confident, was staring at his tray, avoiding eye contact. Jake was fiddling nervously with his phone, and Tyler was munching on a burger without looking up. The dining room was buzzing, but their table was an island of silence. "Did you hear what happened to them?" whispered a girl at the next table. "They said they were trying to play a prank on someone in the lab and something went wrong. Some kind of chemical thing." "Yes, chemistry, of course," her friend chuckled. "I heard they shaved themselves for fun, and now they regret it." Ethan suppressed a smile. He knew the truth, but Brandon and his buddies seemed to be keeping their word. No one mentioned his name. No one talked about what had really happened. He pulled out his phone and checked the video he'd taken from Jake. He still had it, insurance in case they decided to break the deal. "Hey, can I sit down?" Mia's voice brought him out of his thoughts. She was standing at his desk, holding a tray with a salad and a bottle of water. Her dark hair was braided, and there was a cautious kindness in her eyes. Ethan blinked in surprise. "Oh yeah, sure," he said, moving his backpack. Mia sat down across from him. Her gaze slid across the dining room. "Are you okay?" she asked, lowering her voice. "I heard about yesterday. It's all everyone talks about." "I'm fine," Ethan said, though relief and guilt warred inside. "It's just been a weird day." "Weird is an understatement," Mia chuckled. "Brandon and his gang look like they've been through a meat grinder." She nodded in their direction. "What happened there anyway?" Ethan shrugged, trying to look unconcerned. "They said it was a joke gone wrong. I was just there." Mia narrowed her eyes but didn't press. "Well, whatever. You're a good boy for not breaking down. Brandon usually intimidates everyone." "I just want to be left alone," Ethan said, looking at his apple. "I don't like being the center of attention." "I understand," Mia nodded. "But you know, sometimes you have to show that you're not a loser." She smiled, and Ethan felt a warmth he hadn't felt since moving. They ate in silence, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan didn't feel invisible. But the relief was tinged with heaviness. He had used his gift, as his grandmother had taught him, but it had been more than just protection. He had scared them, and part of him had enjoyed it. After dinner, Ethan returned home to his small room with its unpacked boxes. He lay down on his bed and took out his phone to call Grandma Alice. Her voice answered on the first ring, warm but with a hint of concern. "Ethan, how are you?" she asked. I did it, Grandma," he admitted, looking up at the ceiling. "I used my gift. They cornered me, filmed me, humiliated me. I couldn't just stand there." Alice paused, then sighed. "You protected yourself," she said. "But remember what I said. Strength without compassion is cruelty. How did you feel when you did it?" Ethan swallowed. "I was angry. And I liked that they were scared, but now I don't know. Was that right? You stopped them, Alice said. But now it's your choice what to do next. You can be the one who scares, or the one who protects. Choose wisely, Ethan. I'm trying, he said quietly. But it's hard. They've made my life hell. I know, she said, her voice softening. But you are stronger than their malice. Use that strength to build, not destroy. Ethan hung up, but his grandmother's words echoed in his head. He looked at his phone where the video was stored. He could post it, destroy Brandon's reputation with a single click. But that would be too easy, and too much like what Brandon would do. The next day at school, Ethan noticed a change. Brandon and his friends kept to themselves, not making eye contact with him. The school hallways were still buzzing, but the whispers were now about a poor joke in the lab. Ethan was on his way to biology when Mia caught up with him in the hallway. Hey, are you going to science club after school? She asked, adjusting her backpack. Miss Harper said there were some cool experiments there. Ethan hesitated. I don't know. I'm not much of a clubber. Oh, come on, Mia smiled. It'll be fun. And you know, you don't have to be alone all the time. Her words caught him off guard. Okay, he said, feeling a slight smile. Maybe I'll come in. Mia nodded and left, and Ethan felt something in his chest unclench. For the first time in a month, he wasn't just the new kid, but the guilt still gnawed at him. He'd used his gift to stop Brandon, but what if he'd gone too far? He knew it wouldn't be an answer right away, but one thing was certain. School would never be the same. The hallways of Lincoln High School still hummed with the familiar noise, but something was different. Lockers slammed and voices mingled in a single hubbub, but the looks Ethan Miller received as he passed were different than before. His glasses had slipped down his nose, and he pushed them up as he made his way toward the cafeteria. It had been a week since the night in the biology lab where he had used his gift to stop Brandon Clark and his friends. Their bald heads were still the talk of the school, but the rumors of a prank gone wrong were beginning to die down. Ethan felt different, not quite confident but no longer invisible. In the cafeteria, he picked up a tray of pizza and an apple and headed to his usual spot by the window. But he wasn't alone now. Mia, the girl with the dark braid, was already sitting there, leafing through a notebook. She looked up and smiled. Hey, you came, she said, pushing her tray forward. I thought you were going to hide in the lab again. Ethan sat up, smiling slightly. Not today, he said, setting his backpack on the floor. Thought I'd try to be normal. Normal? Mia chuckled, taking a bite of pizza. Normal is a myth in this school. But you're holding up well. Ethan shrugged, but her words warmed his chest. He glanced around the cafeteria. Brandon, Jake, and Tyler were all at their table, but their usual loud chatter had disappeared. Brandon, his hair growing out in wispy clumps, was staring at his plate, avoiding eye contact. Jake was fiddling nervously with his phone, and Tyler was chewing silently, his expression grimmer than usual. Their power seemed to have evaporated, and the cafeteria felt it. The other students no longer gravitated toward their table, and the whispers were about new topics. Basketball games, school clubs, the upcoming dance. They're like shadows now, Mia said quietly, nodding toward Brandon. No one knows what happened, but everyone's noticed that they're not bullying anymore. Maybe they just got bored, Ethan said, trying to sound nonchalant. He knew the truth, but he wasn't about to share it. The video from that night was still on his phone, an insurance policy he hoped he'd never use. Tired of it? Mia narrowed her eyes. After they've been pestering you for a month? I don't believe it. She paused, then added, But you know what's cool? You're not alone anymore. People are starting to notice you. Ethan looked at her, surprised. Did you notice? I just want to be left alone. Well, that doesn't quite work. Mia smiled. When you're no longer a target, people want to know who you are. Are you going to science club today? Miss Harper promised an experiment with lasers. Ethan hesitated. He was used to being a loner, but her invitation sounded sincere. Okay, he said. I'll try. After school, Ethan headed to the biology lab where science club was in session. The room was filled with the hum of voices and the clanking of equipment. Ms. Harper, a teacher with wild hair, was explaining how to set up a laser to measure wavelengths. Ethan walked in, feeling out of place, but Mia waved at him from a corner where a few students were setting up the setup. Hey, new kid, called a guy named Kyle with wild red hair. Come here and help with the mirrors. Ethan looked surprised, but came over. I don't know much about this, he said, adjusting his glasses. It's okay, we'll teach you, Kyle said, handing him a small mirror. Just hold it like this so the beam hits the sensor. Ethan nodded, focusing on the task at hand. For the first time in a month, he felt like he was a part of something. Mia winked at him as she adjusted the laser, and he couldn't help but smile. But guilt still simmered in his chest. He remembered Brandon's fearful eyes and the clumps of hair on the lab floor. He had protected himself. But was he better than them? Later, at an after-school basketball game, Ethan found himself in the crowd. He had come to support Mia, who was helping organize the game. The game was intense. The crowd was roaring. But Brandon, usually the star of the court, was playing worse than usual. His shots were off-kilter, and he avoided the crowd's gaze. Ethan noticed Coach King yelling at him from the sidelines, "Clark, get it together!" Have you forgotten how to shoot? At one point, the ball flew out of bounds right at Ethan's feet. He picked it up, and the crowd went silent. Brandon stood frozen on the court, watching it. Ethan could have used his gift to make the ball fly or something to scare Brandon again. Instead, he simply tossed the ball back, smooth and precise. Brandon caught it, nodded almost imperceptibly, and returned to the game. "That was a good throw," Mia said, sitting down next to him. "You could try for the team." "Me?" Ethan laughed. "I don't mean basketball. I like test tubes better." "Well, the test tubes are cool too," she replied, nudging him with her shoulder. "The main thing is that you're here." After the match, Ethan walked home feeling a lightness he hadn't felt before. School no longer felt like enemy territory. He still kept his gift a secret, but now he knew he could be part of something bigger without using force. But Grandma Alice's question still echoed in his head. You can be the one who scares, or the one who protects. He wanted to choose the latter, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. At home, he lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. His phone was next to him, with the video. He could have destroyed Brandon with one click, but that would have felt too much like revenge. Instead, he texted Mia, "Thanks for tonight. The club was awesome." She responded with an emoji and the word, "Awesome." Ethan smiled. He might not be a star like Brandon, but he was starting to find his place. The biology lab at Lincoln High School was quiet, lit only by the dim light of the setting sun streaming through the windows. Ethan Miller sat at his desk checking data from his cell division project. Test tubes and microscopes lined the shelves, and the air smelled faintly of chemicals. His glasses had slipped down his nose, but he didn't notice, his attention glued to his laptop screen. The school had changed since the night he'd used his gift to stop Brandon Clark and his friends. The bullying had died down, and Ethan was starting to feel less like an outsider. But the shadow of guilt still lingered on his heart. The lab door creaked, and Ethan looked up. Brandon stood there, alone, without Jake or Tyler. His basketball jersey hung a little looser on him than usual, and his blonde hair, which had begun to grow out, stuck out in uneven clumps. He looked unsure of himself, which was completely uncharacteristic. Ethan tensed but remained where he was, clutching his pen. "Can I talk?" Brandon asked, his voice quieter than usual. He didn't come in, but stood at the door, as if afraid to cross the threshold. Ethan looked at him, his fingers trembling. "About what?" he said, trying to keep his voice even. He hadn't known what to expect, but the memory of that night in the lab was still fresh. Brandon cleared his throat, shifting from one foot to the other. I came to apologize," he said, looking at the floor. "For everything. For what we did to each other. It was shitty." Ethan blinked, his eyebrows rising. "Apologize?" he asked, not hiding his surprise. "Are you serious?" Brandon nodded, finally looking up. His face was serious, without his usual smirk. "Yes, seriously," he said. "I was a jerk. We all were. You're different, Organ. And I guess I sensed it. Scared." "Scared?" Ethan leaned forward, his voice sharpening. "You made my life hell, Brandon. You, Jake, Tyler, you bullied me every day. Why should I trust you?" Brandon clenched his fists, not in anger, but rather to steel himself. "I don't expect you to believe me," he said. "But after that night..." He paused, his gaze flickering to the shelf of test tubes where it had all started. "I realized I'd gone too far. And I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be the one who bullies everyone." Ethan was silent, his eyes searching Brandon. He saw fear in his gaze, but also something new. Sincerity. The vial on the shelf shook slightly, responding to Ethan's emotions. But he quickly suppressed the surge of power. "You think an apology will fix this?" he asked, his voice cold. You made a video, humiliating me in front of the entire school. Why now? Brandon swallowed, his face turning red. Because I saw what you were capable of, he admitted. And I realized you could have done worse. But you didn't. You gave us a chance. I want to be better, man. I really do. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his fingers relaxing. He remembered Grandma Alice's words. Strength is in protecting, not destroying. He could have destroyed Brandon by posting that video, but instead, he held back. And now Brandon stood before him without his usual bravado, just a guy who had realized the error of his ways. I don't trust you, Ethan said, his voice softening but still firm. You've done too much for me to just forget, but I can see you're trying. That means something. Brandon nodded, his shoulders slumping as if a weight had been lifted. Thanks, he said quietly. I don't expect us to be friends, but I promise I won't bother you again. And I'll tell Jake and Tyler to back off too. Ethan looked at him, noticing how Brandon's thinning hair was beginning to grow back. His gift seemed to be as temporary as he'd hoped. Okay, he said. But if you start again, I won't be so kind. Brandon smiled faintly for the first time without mockery. Got it, he said. You're not who I thought you were, Oregon. Ethan, he corrected. My name is Ethan. Brandon nodded. Ethan, he repeated as if tasting the name. Okay, Ethan, I'm going. He turned and walked out, leaving the door ajar. Ethan watched him go, feeling a strange mix of relief and disbelief. He hadn't expected an apology, especially from Brandon, but something about it felt real. He pulled out his phone where the video of that night was stored, the falling hair, the panic, his own eyes burning. He could use it to keep Brandon at bay, but that would feel too much like revenge. Ethan turned off the screen and pocketed the phone. That evening, sitting in his room, he called Grandma Alice. Her voice answered immediately, warm and soothing. Ethan, how are you? She asked. Brandon apologized, he said, looking out the window where the lights of the neighboring houses flickered in the darkness. I didn't expect that. I thought he'd still hate me. And what do you feel? Alice asked, her voice soft but attentive. Ethan paused, choosing his words. I don't know. I'm still angry, but he seemed sincere. Maybe he really does want to change. People can change, Alice said, but that's their choice. You gave him a chance, and that speaks of your strength. Not the one in your gift, but the one in your heart. I try, Grandma, Ethan said, smiling, but it's not that easy. I know, she replied, but you're on the right track. Ethan hung up, feeling the weight of the last few weeks lift. He hadn't become Brandon's friend, but there was something new between them. Understanding. School was no longer a battlefield. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe freely. The spring sun streamed through the halls of Lincoln High School, reflecting off the polished floors and metal lockers. Ethan Miller walked to biology, his backpack swinging slightly over his shoulder. His glasses had slipped down his nose as usual, but he pushed them up with a small smile. It had been a month since that night in the lab, when he had used his gift to stop Brandon Clark and his friends. The school had changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The bullying that had once been a part of everyday life had become a rarity. Ethan was no longer the new kid from Oregon. He was just Ethan. In the hallway, he spotted a freshman, a skinny kid with big glasses being pinned against a locker by an older kid in a football jersey. Come on, kid, where's your money? He barked, his voice echoing down the hall. Ethan stopped. He could have walked past as the others had done, but something inside him resisted. He stepped forward. Hey, he said, his voice calm but firm. Leave him alone. The senior turned around, squinting. Who are you? He asked, straightening up. Get out of here before you get into trouble. Ethan met his gaze, not looking away. I said leave him, he repeated. His fingers trembled slightly, and the locker next to him made a slight creak, as if the metal was responding to his emotions. The high schooler froze, his face pale. Okay, dude, relax, he muttered, stepping back. I was just kidding. He walked away with a final look of uncertainty. The freshman adjusted his glasses, his eyes full of gratitude. Thank you, he said quietly. My name is Liam. Ethan, he replied, smiling slightly. Don't let them intimidate you. If anything happens, come find me. Liam nodded and ran off, and Ethan felt a warmth in his chest. He hadn't used his gift, but he knew he could. And that was enough. He remembered Granny Alice's words, "Your power is to protect, not to destroy." For the first time, he understood what that meant. In the biology lab, Ethan joined the science club where Mia and Kyle were already setting up equipment for a new experiment. The lab was buzzing with voices, the clinking of test tubes, and laughter. Mia waved at him, her dark braid bouncing. "Hey, you're late," she said, handing him a pipette. "Would you like some help with the solutions?" "Unless you make me clean the test tubes again," Ethan joked, and Kyle laughed. "He's learning," Kyle said, adjusting the microscope. "He'll be chief chemist soon." Ethan smiled, feeling at home. He was no longer a loner hiding behind books. The science club had become his refuge, but now it was not from the world, but with it. After school, Ethan sat in the park where the spring trees were blooming with bright white flowers. His grandmother, Alice, was visiting from Oregon, and they met on a bench by the pond. Her gray hair was pulled back into a bun, and her eyes were proud. "You look happier," she said, her voice warm as sunlight. "I'm trying," Ethan said, looking at the water where the clouds were reflected. "School. It's not the same anymore. I've found friends, and I think I've found myself." Alice nodded, her hand on his shoulder. "You used your gift wisely, Ethan," she said. "You protected yourself, but you did not become the one who destroys. That is true strength." "I'm still learning," he admitted. "Sometimes I want to use it to make things easier, but I don't want to be like them." "And you won't," said Alice. "You choose your path, and I believe it will be the right one." Ethan smiled, feeling the last weight lifted from his shoulders by her words. He looked out at the pond where the ducks swam lazily in circles. His gift was still there, but now he knew how to channel it, not through anger, but through compassion. The next day at school, Ethan noticed a scene that made him freeze. Brandon Clark, his hair nearly grown out, was standing in the hallway where an older boy was picking on a younger student. Brandon stepped forward. "Hey, get away from him," he said, his voice firm but lacking his usual malice. The senior snorted. "What, are you a defender of the weak now?" he said, but backed away under Brandon's gaze. The younger student muttered a thank you and ran away. Brandon turned and caught Ethan's eye. He nodded, barely noticeable, and moved on. Ethan felt a small smile on his lips. They were not friends, but something had changed between them, a respect that needed no words. That evening, Ethan returned to the lab to finish the project. The room was filled with soft light, and he sat at his desk, opening his laptop. Mia and Kyle joined him, discussing plans for the next experiment. "We should try something with lasers," Mia said, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Only if I don't set the lab on fire," Ethan joked, and Kyle laughed. "You're our hero now," Kyle said. "If anything happens, we'll cover you." Ethan smiled at them. He was no longer an outcast. He was part of something bigger, not just the science club, but a school that was beginning to change. His gift remained a secret, but he knew he could use it to protect, like Liam, like others who needed help. He remembered his grandmother's words. "You're stronger than they think," and now he believed it. The sun was setting, filling the lab with golden light. Ethan hunched over his notes, surrounded by his friends, and for the first time felt like he was home.